Good morning, my dear friends. It is my great pleasure to meet you all through this video one more time. This time we are discussing about the reproduction in plants as well as in animals. Unit number 17. If you look at the introductory part, all the living organisms in this world has to live for a shorter lifespan. Some of the living organisms like bacteria and all, they will have small lifetime. And if you look at the elephants, tortoise and all, they have a longer lifespan comparing the human beings. So in this aspect of this a small lifetime, these organisms has to reproduce, make their own copies, or else that will be the end of that particular species. So reproduction is a process of making the replica or the successive offsprings of that particular species. This is all required for the survival of that particular species of living organism. So every living being reproduces, but the mode of reproduction is not the same through all the type of living organism. It changes. How do they change? What are the types of reproduction? So let's start with the plants first. You know very well the plants can be reproduced through many methods. So we have some regular practice. Let's say you go to a nursery garden and you purchase a new plant. If you observe that it may not be a fresh plant, instead they may have tried a stem cutting. You know that what is called a stem cutting. A part of the stem can be cut and place it in the soil, pour some water and manure, that will give rise to a new plant. Of course, human beings are involved in this type of, but still these plants can reproduce through various methods. What are the major category of methods? If you look into that, the first one is vegetative mode of reproduction. Second one is asexual mode of reproduction and sexual mode of reproduction. So one by one we will see this, and the first one is vegetative reproduction. What is called a vegetative reproduction? What is the meaning of the word vegetative? Except the reproductive part of the plant, that is the flower, all other part of the plant is called vegetative part. That means root, stem, leaves, the major part. The buds, of course, other things are also joined. These members can participate in successful reproduction in plants. Let's look into the one by one. The stem, first one. How come the stem reproduce? Stem cutting, that's by us. But in the case of strawberry plant, let's take an example of strawberry. Strawberry plant has a very weak stem, so when it grows, it will bend itself and it will touch the soil. Wherever it touches the soil from the nodes, they will give rise to small adventitious roots. These roots will firmly fix on the soil, and later this plant can detach from the mother plant. So the new plant can grow as such. So that is a mode of reproduction, vegetative mode, through the stems. If you look at another example of vegetative reproduction by leaves, the leaves of a bryophyllum plant can give rise to small plants. These plants, when it falls on the ground, it can give rise to a new organism, bryophyllum plant. So leaf also taking part in the vegetative reproduction. Example is the bryophyllum. The next one is the bulbils. What is a bulbil? If you look at the bud of the plant, these buds can change into a bulb-like structure, and this bulb-like structure, when it falls on the ground, that will start to grow into a new organism. The next vegetative reproduction through the roots. If you look at the sweet potato and all these things, you can make a cut of that particular part, can keep it in a soil in a fertile condition, that will start giving rise to a new plant. So roots also can participate in the reproduction. Coming to the next one, bulbils. A bud can give rise to a bulb-like structure. When it falls on the ground, that particular thing can start growing into a new plant. So vegetative reproduction through bulbils is also possible in the case of plants. Example is algae. If you look at the vegetative reproduction in smaller living beings like algae and fungus, all these things, let's discuss one by one. In the case of filamentous algae, fragmentation is the best method that these filamentous algae are following. That means each filament can cut into small pieces, fragmented. Every single fragment can give rise to a new algae. And the example is Spirogyra. Spirogyra is a filamentous algae that is actually going for fragmentation for the vegetative mode of reproduction. The next mode of vegetative reproduction in smaller organisms like amoeba and all, it is like these microscopic organisms, the parent cell can divide into two, fission. So through fission, these microbes can divide into two and two daughter cells are formed. This is another vegetative mode of reproduction that happens in microscopic organisms like amoeba. And let's look into another mode of vegetative reproduction is budding. If we look at the case of yeast, these cells will not go for other modes. Instead, these parent cell will make a bulging, a small bud-like apparatus on the top of the parent body, and this bud will keep growing into a new living organism and it will detach from the parent body. This mode of reproduction is called budding. And the last one, let's discuss one more, is regeneration. That means in the case of Hydra and Planaria, all these organisms, if they lose one particular part of their body, that can give rise to the entire plant, Planaria or Hydra, the organism as such. Such type of mechanism is called regeneration. That means a lost part of their body itself can give rise to the entire organism. Example is Hydra and Planaria. So this type of vegetative reproduction is called regeneration. So that is all about in the vegetative reproduction methods in the living organism. We have seen few. So let me conclude. Vegetative mode of reproduction. Vegetative mode of reproduction is a type of reproduction that happens in the living organism by not participating any sexual methods. Their vegetative part of their body alone takes part. In the case of plant vegetatively reproduce through leaves, stem, roots, bulbils. In the case of algae, they go for fragmentation. In the case of yeast, they go for budding. In the case of amoeba, they go for fission. And some organisms like Hydra, Planaria and all, they can go for regeneration. These are all the methods of reproduction by considering the vegetative mode of reproduction. Let's look into the next one. Let us go through the unit 17, reproduction in plants and animals. Let's start with the word reproduction. What does it mean? It is actually making the exact copies of a particular organism so that they keep living, surviving in this planet. Or else we call them as self-perpetuation. What are the types? That is the next point we have to see. Does all these living organisms reproduce in the same manner? No. Reproduction happens in plants, microbes, all these things are in different ways. Reproduction happens in mainly vegetative mode, asexual and sexual mode. Let's look into the first one, vegetative. That means vegetative parts of the plant is taking part in the reproduction. For an example, The vegetative part of the plant, that means apart from the reproductive part of the plant, that is the flowers. So apart from the flower, the other part, leaves, stem, root, all these are called vegetative part. So how come these vegetative parts are taking part in the reproduction? Let's see them one by one. If you look at the leaves, in the case of bryophyllum, in the leaf nurtures, in the leaf itself, minute plants will arise, they will fall and they will start growing as a fresh new plant. So the vegetative part, leaf, helping in the reproduction. Coming to the next one, stem. If you look at the strawberry plant has a weak stem. So due to that, the stem may bend down and it will start growing by developing the roots. So this new plant will separate and it will grow as an individual new plant. That is how stems are taking part in the reproduction of plants. Looking at the next one, root is also a vegetative part of the plant. Example, sweet potatoes. If you cut the sweet potato into pieces and place it in the soil, this root can start the reproduction by growing into a whole new organism. Coming to the next one, bulbils. In the case of agave, a plant, they reproduce through bulbils, a vegetative part. A bud, this will fall, this will form a bulb like structure and it will fall and start growing new plants. This one is called as bulbils. So next, if you look at the vegetative reproduction in algae, they go for fragmentation. Every single fragment will give rise to a whole new organism. This type of vegetative reproduction is happening in Spirogyra, a filamentous algae. Coming to the next one is fission. Just like amoebas, this whole amoeba will divide into two and each one will grow into an individual organism. This type of reproduction is called fission. This is also a vegetative mode of reproduction because there is no male or female gametes are involved in this. Coming to the next one is budding. This happens in the case of yeast. Yeast will start growing. Let's say this is an yeast. The minute bud will start arising here and it will keep growing and it will detach and individual bud will grow into a whole new organism. This is a type of reproduction in yeast. Coming to the next one, regeneration. This happens in the case of hydra and all these organisms. What happens? Let's say a part of their body is lost. Let's say this part is lost and this part alone can regenerate into a whole new organism. This type of vegetative reproduction is called as regeneration. So in this one we have discussed the vegetative mode of reproduction, that means reproduction through vegetative part of an organism. In the case of plants, leaves are able to make reproduction, stem is able to make reproduction and root is able to make reproduction. Bulbils also is able to make reproduction. Whereas in the case of algae, they go for fragmentation, amoeba they go for fission and yeast is going for budding, hydra is going for regeneration. These are the methods of vegetative reproduction that happens around. Let's look into the next mode of reproduction is asexual reproduction. That means only single parent is involved in this type of reproduction. Male and female gametes, all these things are not involved. Also in this type of reproduction, only mitotic cell divisions are involved. I hope you remember what is called mitosis and meiosis cell divisions. So let's take an example of rhizopus, a fungus, And in this case, rhizobus reproduce through asexual mode of reproduction, that is spore formation. Rhizobus is a fungus. During the spore formation time, they just form a bulb-like structure on the top of it. It's called sporangium. Inside the sporangium, nucleus will go for enormous number of mitotic division. That means taking copies of each, and this numerous number of nucleus, they will gather a small amount of cytoplasm and make an enclosed ball-like structure called spore. And this sporangium, it will burst open, and these spores will spread through the air, water or any medium. When it falls on a favorable condition, they will start growing into a new rhizobus. New rhizobus mycelium will start growing from that particular spore, and later this will enlarge itself to a successful hyphae. So this is type of reproduction through spore formation is called asexual mode of reproduction. The next mode of reproduction is asexual reproduction. The name itself says there is no sex involved. There is no involvement of male or female gametes. And how come this is happening? Mostly in the case of rhizopus, a fungus, from its hyphae, the fungal body, a sporangium, a structure develops. Inside, this nucleus will divide into too many numbers, and each nucleus will carry a small quantity of cytoplasm, and these minute structures are called spores. These spores will burst open, and these spores will be released in the open air. So wherever this spore will fall on a favorable condition, the fungal mycelium will start growing, and a new fungal growth will start from that. So there is no involvement of male or female gametes involved. So this kind of reproduction is called asexual reproduction. That is the reproduction through spores. This is mostly happening in the case of fungus. Example is rhizopus. Let's look into the next one, reproduction in the plants by the sexual methods. Let's look into the next part, the sexual reproduction in plants. Since it is a sexual mode of reproduction, male and female gametes with half set of chromosomes are required. You know well, flowers are the reproductive part of the plant. If you look at the structure of a typical flower, you can see that it has 4 parts: calyx, corolla, androecium and gynoecium. These flowers are a modified shoot. That is the thing you should remember first. And this flower that has 4 parts, the first 2, calyx and corolla, they are not directly taking part in the reproduction in plants. So let's start with the other 2, androecium and gynoecium. Androecium is the male part inside a flower, and gynoecium is the female part of the flower. Androecium is a male part of the plant that contains stamens. Each stamen has a stalk or a support called filaments, as well as a bag-like structure on the top of it. We call them as anther. Inside this anther, it's a bag-like structure, the pollen grains are start produced. These pollen grains are produced inside the pollen sac, which is present on the anther itself. So anther consists of pollen bag that actually creating the male part of male gametes of the plant. Let's look into the pollen grains, which are actually produced inside the pollen sac, which is on the anther by the cell division called meiosis. So entire male gametes that is produced inside the pollen sac actually contains half set of chromosome of that particular species of plant. Before we start the sexual reproduction in plants, we should have a thorough understanding of the structure of a flower, which is the reproductive part of the plant. If you look at the flower has mainly two parts. First one is consisting of the stigma and a style and an ovary, which three of them consist the gynoecium. You have studied this in earlier classes. If you look at the male side, the androecium, they have an anther and a filament. And to attract this insect and other things, you have petals and sepals as calyx and corolla. That is the additional part which is not necessary, not directly taking part in the reproduction. So, we will study this androecium and gynoecium part. That means stigma, style and ovary in the case of gynoecium, and anther and filament in the case of androecium. So, that is the male and female part of the flower. This anther that has a pollen sacs inside, which is producing the pollen grain, which is like the male gamete, that with only the half set of chromosomes inside it. And here you have ovaries that has egg inside, that is also the female part of it, that is also having half set of chromosomes inside. So, when they join together and individually new zygote, an organism is formed with the actual set of chromosomes of that particular organism. If you look at the structure of a pollen grain is spherical in shape, that has two cell wall outside, exine, inside you got intine. This exine, the outer covering, has a germ pole through which it can start germinating. These pollen grains outer membrane is made up of cellulose and pectin kind of carbohydrates, which are very complex in nature. A mature pollen grain that has two cells inside. One is the vegetative cell, another one is the generative cell. This generative cell will also divide mitotically into two male gametes. Remember, these gametes has only half set of chromosomes. That means they are haploid. Whereas the vegetative cell that has the normal 2n set of, that means diploid set of chromosomes are present, whereas this generative cells, the male gametes has only half set of chromosomes in it. Let us look into the anther, pollen grain and gynoecium structure. If you look at the anther, that has a pollen bags inside, which will undergo meiotic cell division, that will make the male gametes, which are half set of chromosomes. They have a filament that actually makes this one attached to the flower. It collectively anther and filament is called as stamen. That is the entire male part of the flower. If you look at the pollen grain exactly, which is produced from here, the pollen bags, these pollen grains are spherical in shape. They have two layers, exine and intine, where exine is a little hard, made up of cellulose. This one has also a germ pole, so that this, when the pollen grains start germinating, it can come through this minute pole. And next one is, it is a generative cell and a vegetative cell are present inside. Vegetative cell and as a nucleus. Also they have a generative cell with another nucleus. This generative cell divides to form male gametes, that too half set of chromosomes. So, this is the structure of a pollen grain, two layered spherical with two nucleus inside, generative as well as vegetative cells inside. So, next one is gynoecium, the female part of the flower. This part has a stigma where the pollen grains come and fall and stick with this. From there it can start growing. It has a pipeline called style, and At the end of this, they have an ovary. Inside you got female gametes are stored inside. This is called ovule. Structure of this part alone we will see one more time. That is the structure of gynoecium. Like we have seen the pollen grain in detail, this female gamete, this area also we will see one more time. Let's see that. Let's look into the next part of the plant, that is the gynoecium. The female part of the plant is called gynoecium. And this gynoecium actually consists of carpels. They have ovary, style and stigma. In this, the ovary contains the ovules. If you look at the structure of an ovule, which is the exact part which is inside where the fertilization happens. Let's look into the structure of ovule now. The main part of the ovule is called nucellus. Let's take a spherical shape, nucellus, that has two integuments covering on it, that also leaves a hole in the bottom. It's called micropyle. This ovule is attached to the wall of the ovary of the flower through a stalk called funiculus. So funiculus attached to the wall of the ovary, that will come arise, leaving two integuments covering the nucellus inside. That is the structure you should remember, the basic structure of an ovule. Inside this one, the top part where these integuments are arising is called chalaza. This nucellus has the embryo sac inside. Inside the embryo sac, if you look at that, there are 7 cells and 8 nucleus. 3 cells at the micropylar end forming the egg apparatus. That means 2 synergid cells and 1 egg on it. That's the 3 cells on the micropylar part, and on the chalazal part on the top of it, you have again 3 more cells are present. The 3 cells which are present on the chalazal part is called antipodal cells. So far we have seen 6 cells, but earlier I told you we have 7 cells and 8 nucleus. But so far we finished only 6 cells that has 6 nucleus inside. If you look at the entire embryo sac, that has 2 polar nucleus. So 6 plus 2, you got 8 nucleus. All of them are in haploid structure. So the embryo sac itself is a cell, so you can consider them as a 7th one. The female reproductive part of the flower is called gynoecium, that has a stigma, style and an ovary. Inside this ovary, you have these ovules attached to the wall. This ovule, I have made a larger diagram in which these ovules are attached to the walls of the ovary through funiculus. And the main part of this entire ovule is called nucellus, that has an embryo sac inside. This embryo sac contains 7 cells and 8 nucleus. How come it is? If you look at this, number of cells 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and embryo sac 7. But if you look at the number of nucleus present inside, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is the setup inside the embryo sac. If you look at this is the egg which is supported by synergid cells on the micropylar area. Micropyle is a gap at the bottom of this through which the pollen tube or the male gametes, pollen grains, through this micropyle the pollen tube enters and bursts release of the male gametes. So this is the micropyle area, and these 3 are called antipodal cells. This is the embryo sac, and this entire area is the nucellus, and these 2 integuments are holding it, leaving a hole on the bottom, that is called micropyle area. This structure on the top, it is called chalaza, the supportive is funiculus, and this is the entire structure of an ovule. So far we have discussed is the male and female part of a plant flower. The male part is called androecium, that actually producing pollen grains with the half set of chromosomes. And if you look at the gynoecium, that has ovaries inside. Inside the ovary you have ovules. Inside that ovule you have eggs inside it. These eggs are also having half set of chromosomes. So how come this male gamete with the half set of chromosomes and a female egg with half set of chromosome join together to form a new organism? It's called through sexual reproduction. That is what is coming next. This sexual reproduction happens with the help of two major stages. First one is pollination, second one is fertilization. Let's see one by one how it is happening. Let's start the next topic, pollination. What is called pollination in plants? That is transfer of the pollen grain from anther to the stigma is called pollination. If you look at the case, the anther and stigma may not be in the same plant or may not be in the same flower itself. So based on this, we are going to just classify this pollination into two, that is self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination means in the same flower itself you have anther and stigma. Example is hibiscus plant. Whereas in some other cases of plants, these flower part, anther and stigma may not be present on the same flower itself. So they may have male flower separate and female flower separate. Sometimes male flower may be in a different plant itself, male plant and female plant itself. So in these cases, you need some agents to carry this pollen grain from the anther to the stigma. Example of this type of plant is apples, plum, all these things are the example of this. Both this self-pollination and cross-pollination, they have their own advantage as well as disadvantages. If you look at the advantage of self-pollination is that they don't require any type of external agents. That means loss of pollen grain is not happening. Most of the pollen grain will fall on the stigma itself. They don't need an external agents to to carry the pollen grain from that particular organism to another one. If you look at the disadvantages of self-pollination is that they don't form much endosperm. Since there is no strong endosperm support, the plants may produce will be weak plants. And the next disadvantages is they are producing less number of seeds. And one more disadvantage of this cross pollination is new varieties of the same species of plants will not be produced because it is producing the same copies of the same plant, no more new varieties, which may be dangerous for the plant due to the environmental change. And if you look at the cross pollination, its advantages is the number of seeds and number of pollen grains are huge in number. Some of this cross pollination happens with the help of some insect. So to attract this insect, these flowers will look like so colorful and fantastic. These cross pollination also lead to go for the production of new varieties of the same species, so that they can withstand on this earth surface with a better adaptations. If you look at the disadvantages of the cross pollination is that more number of pollen grains will be wasted, and you have to always, these plants has to always depend on some external agents to transfer this pollen grain. And sometimes even though this cross pollination leads to new varieties, sometimes they may develop an undesirable character, which is not at all required or which is dangerous for the plant itself may arise because of the combination of the gametes from a plant also from another plant. When they join together, an undesirable character can start. And if you look at another disadvantage of this cross pollination is that sometimes the pollination itself may fail due to some external barriers like a flood. So due to some kind of external barrier, the entire pollination itself may stopped. As the next topic, if you look at the importance of this pollination is that this pollination only leads to fruits and seeds formation. And also this pollination causes new varieties to happen. And if you look at the next topic, that what are the agents that is responsible for transfer of this pollen grain from one location to another location. There are some of the pollen grains are transferred with the help of wind, water, insect, animals, like that it keep going. We will see them one by one. This actually requires agents. So let's say the agents are 4 in major category. First one is wind. This is called anemophilic. Example is grass. Grass has the pollen grains which is very lightweight and dry, so that the wind can take it away, so it can fall on somewhere another grass that has a female flower in it. Insects is called entomophily. Example, honeybees, they are coming to the flowers, take the nectar. In fact, they are carrying the pollen grains also. When they go to the next flower, this pollen grains will be on that particular flower that has a stigma in it. So this way the insects are making the pollen transfer possible. This type of entomophilic plants will have a colorful petals, and they may have nectar, the honey, the sweet tasty nectar also may be present inside to attract these insects. Coming to the next one, water as a medium to transport the pollen grains. Such plants are called hydrophilic plants. Example, hydrilla. These pollen grains will be they may have wax coating so that it will not start decaying when it is in the water. It may also have air bubbles inside, so that this pollen grain will not sink. Instead, it will keep floating till it reaches the next female flower in the hydrilla. Coming to the last one, animals, they help in the transport of pollen grain, called zoophilic plants. Example, squirrels. In the silk cotton tree, the squirrels are actually transporting the pollen grains from one plant to another plant, one anther to another stigma. So far we were discussing, in the case of sexual reproduction in the plant, step number 1, pollination. Step number 2 is fertilization. That means fusion of male and female gametes. How does it happen? Let's see them one by one, step by step. The first step itself is the pollen grain which falls on the right stigma will start germinating. In the sense, this pollen grain has a strong hard shell exine that is a minute pore inside. Through this pore, the germination of a pollen tube happens. So the entire content inside the pollen grain that we have discussed earlier, all these parts will start coming to the pollen tube. That is the first step happens in the case of fertilization. In the next stage, this pollen tube that is keep growing to the style and stigma will reach the ovule through the micropyle. So such a long tube, pollen tube, will be formed. So at this stage, this vegetative cell present inside the pollen tube will degenerate, and this generative cell will divide into two to form two male gametes. That is the third step. And in the next fourth step, this pollen tube, the tip of the pollen tube that already reached the micropyle, will burst open and it will release the two gametes. In the next stage of fifth stage, this one male gamete will go and fuse with the egg to form the zygote. To this secondary nucleus, the second sperm will go and fuse. Nucleus, which are N haploid, and one male sperm that is also haploid. So a 3N format will be formed. This 3N will go for the formation of primary endosperm nucleus, which in later stages of fruit development, this endosperm, that means edible part, that apple or coconut or whatever we eat, that's called endosperm, the nutrition that is stored so that the seeds can grow. This endosperm is developed from this triplet 3N set of chromosomes, which is produced by the fusion of second male gamete with the secondary nucleus. It is called triple fusion. At this stage, we should remember one more term is called double fertilization. What is called double fertilization? Fertilization of the male and female gametes are fused, And the next fusion was with the second male gamete joined with the secondary nucleus. So, 2 times fertilization happen. One will develop into an embryo, another one will develop into a primary endosperm nucleus. So, 2 fertilizations are happening. So, this is also called as double fertilization, which is a very important point you should remember. The primary endosperm nucleus will develop into an endosperm, that means the fleshy part of the fruit that is edible most of the time for us. That is the next development stage. And after this, antipodal cells and synergid cells will degenerate. I hope you remember the structure of an ovule. Inside the nucleus, you got next to the embryo, the micropylar region, you have 2 supporting synergid cells. That one, and on the chalacal side, 3 cells, these cells will degenerate. These are the events happening during the fertilization. Let's look into the fertilization happenings. First thing, let me tell you, this is the gynoecium, ovary, this is stigma, and you have made a ovule also inside, little larger in size. Step number 1, the pollen grain will fall, and through this pole in the egg sign of the pollen grain, minute tube will arise. It's called pollen tube. This will reach the micropylar region of the ovule. Through this, the entire part of the pollen grain will start traveling. On this traveling, the vegetative cell, the part of that pollen grain, will degenerate, and the generative cell nucleus will divide into 2 to form 2 male gametes. So, 2 male gametes are traveling in the pollen tube. This will keep traveling, and the pollen tube will burst open next to this micropylar area. This one, the first gamete, the first fusion is formation of zygote by the fusion of male gamete and the female gamete here. So, that is the fusion number 1. While this is happening, these polar nuclei will also fuse to form 2n format, fusion number 2. These polar nuclei, which is also n plus n, half set of chromosome, half set of chromosome. So, you got 2n, this is fusion number 2. And the third one, to this 2n, the second gamete, male gamete, will fuse to make 3n, that is 3 set of chromosomes. This, since there is 3 fusions, 1, 2 and 3. First one is from the male and female, second one is polar nucleus joining, and third one is the polar nucleus which is made 2n with the second male gamete. So, altogether you have 3 fusions happening inside. This, it is called as triple fusion. It is also called as double fertilization because the first fertilization happens within the first male gamete and the egg. Next thing, this secondary nucleus will also combine with the next second male gamete. So, this is fertilization number 1 and this is fertilization number 2. So, 2 fertilizations happening inside. First one is the male gamete, the first male gamete with the egg. Second one is to the secondary nucleus, polar nucleus will join. So, secondary nucleus combined with the second male gamete. So, this is also called as double fertilization. So far we have seen the fertilization, how it is happening inside the ovule. The pollen grains will fall, the pollen tube that will bring all the content of the pollen grain. On the traveling, the vegetative part will degenerate, the generative cell will divide into make the male gametes. First male gamete, when it reaches here the micropylar area of the ovule, it will burst open and the first one will fuse with the egg. Next one will fuse with the secondary nucleus, which is already 2n after the first fusion of polar nucleus. So that will make a 3n. This will form the endosperm. This primary endosperm nucleus and this egg, what will happen after this process will finish? After this process will finish, this ovule will develop into a seed. These integuments, we have seen these integuments in the structure of ovule. These two integuments will become the seed coat. And the last one is the entire ovary itself become the entire fruit. This will happen after this fertilization process completes. Post-fertilization changes. And this is the end of this video, and we will see you in the session 2, sexual reproduction in human beings. Until then, apart from this topic, I would like to tell you that during this COVID-19 pandemic, please stay away from dangerous things. Stay safe and stay healthy. And remember, staying healthy is like having healthier habits of personal hygiene, and also staying healthy, it also says few more aspects. Take plenty of sleep that actually will make your body to repair wherever it has the damage. So to fight this COVID pandemic, you need to have plenty of vitamins, minerals, and quality of things inside your body. So prefer quality food. Remember, quality food will not be coming always with a good taste. It doesn't mean that the things that they taste well don't have good quality. Sometimes the things that your mother cooks may not be tasty, but it may be good quality. So eat all the vegetables, take good quality of food, sleep well, and personal hygiene. With this, we can fight this COVID-19, and I hope we will meet again in person as in olden days in the same classroom. Hope that happens soon, and we will see you in the next session, reproduction in human beings. Thank you.